So Scott and I are going to walk you through what the molecular point of departure group has been doing in the past year. So I guess before I say that, I just want to, it's interesting that you learn something new every time every day. And in Mark's presentation, you mentioned, the taste test. So I had to look up that, and Thomas Willis described it, the urine taste as wonderfully sweet, like sugar and honey in patients that had diabetes. So it's really interesting. And aside. So next slide. So here, our group started a couple of years ago, and we've been working diligently. Great group of people to work with, and we started out with a problem statement which has evolved over time. It's shown here, and I kind of want to walk through this because this is really our roadmap for the working group. So what we are trying to do is to develop a framework, a process to derive an in vivo transcriptome point of departure. So in vivo animals, that's our focus. Could be applied to cells as well, or other in vitro systems. We're using the transcriptome. Could be other omics as well, but because the transcriptome is relatively mature from a technical standpoint, that's what we are focusing on. The fit for purpose is really eventually our goal is to get this process being used in chemical risk assessment. So not pharmaceuticals, largely because a goal here is not to identify a specific hazard. It's really to identify a use that is safe. And that really is more applicable to the chemical space rather than the pharmaceutical space. So we're going to derive a PUD that will produce a human health protective point of departure, so protective against all possible apical endpoints, and it's based upon what we have termed this concerted molecular change. So and the definition of that, we have a definition, but how we derive that remains to be seen. So next slide, please. So here's our group. And I want to really thank everybody in this group over the past couple of years. Again, it's a wonderful group to work with, lots of engagement across industry, academia, as well as government. And if anybody has, an interest in this, we certainly welcome additional members and their ideas and input. So next slide. So here's kind of what we're going to be going through. Our achievements, so publication in Toxicology, form article, going to spend a few slides on that. And then Scott's going to take over to describe a roundtable session that we have had accepted for the next SOT meeting, and then some additional work that was spurred by our past couple of years of thinking. So next slide. So our big achievement for this year was we had a forum article on our vision, our framework, accepted in Toxicology. That's really was a result of a lot of discussion, a lot of work over the past couple of years, really to crystallize our thoughts around this problem. And I'll say, this whole idea of using transcriptome POD in a regulatory environment really was started by Rusty Thomas, about 15 years ago now, and we're just trying to get this idea pushed to the forefront so that it will actually be used in the regulatory environment. So next slide. So I'm going to go through. We had some principles that were outlined in that publication. 4 of them are shown here. But these principles and this whole idea is really based upon this adverse outcome pathway, which I think we all sort of agree is the way that toxicology works. So you have exposure, then you have molecular change. And if you can measure molecular change comprehensively, then in theory, you should be able to use that in a safety assessment paradigm. But what we do now is we actually measure the next step, which is deriving conducting animal studies and then measuring the apical effects. But can we actually step back and instead of using the apical effects, which might take a couple of years to manifest in a cancer bioassay, can we step back and use the molecular data to derive a POD instead, which might only take a few weeks of exposure or a few days of exposure. So we have these 4 principles that we think need to be realized before the vision could be accepted. Next slides go through those 4 principles. So principle 1, transcriptomics is a reliable tool for detecting alterations in gene expression after chemical exposure. I think that's a pretty standard sort of dogma. You know, we have the tools already in place. They're widely accessible. They're routinely used. We have processes in place that have been distilled over, you know, several years to develop best practices. We have open source software to do this. We have methods to derive points of departure. So I think this principle is fairly well established from a scientific perspective. Next, yep. So principle 2. Alterations in gene expression are indicators of adverse or adaptive biological responses to chemical exposure. I think this is also fairly well-founded. You know, so given sufficient exposure, if the dose is high enough, cells will alter the amount of mRNA that they produce across the entire transcriptome. I think that's been observed in all, if not nearly all, if not all studies where gene expression data have been analyzed after exposure. And of course, you know, the downstream effect of alterations in mRNA are alterations of protein levels and functional output. That contributes to either maintaining homeostasis or an adaptive response, or results in pathology or toxicity. And again, you know, the examples of this are extensive, and we hypothesize that they're associated with any adverse effect. So any adverse response will have a change in the transcriptome. Sorry, if you go back there. So again, we're focused on the transcriptome. You know, from Mark's talk, you know, we could be analyzing the metabolome as well as the proteome or the epigenome, but because of the maturity of the transcriptome, you know, that's been our main focus so far. Next slide, please. So principle 3, transcriptomics can be used to establish a benchmark dose-based point of departure from short-term in vivo studies at a dose below which concerted molecular change is not expected. So if concerted molecular change drives toxicity, we can actually identify that point along the dose response curve using transcriptomics and benchmark dose-based methods. And do this from short-term studies, so exposures of several days, maybe a subchronic study, and actually predict effects that will predict a point of departure for an apical endpoint that would occur in the future. So we understand the concerted molecular change to be the dose-dependent inflection point in gene expression where the frequency of change exceeds the background variation. So kind of depicted visually in that graph here, the y-axis is just a gene expression response. In this case, it's actually the number of genes that have a point of departure, so an accumulation plot over the dose response. And as you increase the dose, a few genes begin to be changed, but then you reach this point along the dose response curve where a lot of stuff begins to happen, right? You get this rise in the transcriptome response. And we hypothesize that this is the point of concerted molecular change. Deriving that requires understanding of normal variation in the system, right? What is the POD needs to be a clear departure from the normal range. And there are a variety of methods that the group is going through and exploring right now to identify this point of departure, this concerted molecular change, using either gene level data, individual gene level data, using pathway level data, such as the technique currently deployed in BMD Express. There could be other methods though as well. And so the committee is completely open to new ideas on how to derive this point of departure. So principle 4, this really gets at its use in the regulatory environment now. So if the first 3 principles can be established, the use of a transcriptome POD set at that CMC dose level will provide strong protection for use in risk assessment. And this is really where the vision here is transformative, right? So instead of examining apical endpoints, let's examine molecular endpoints, derive a POD, and use that in risk assessment. And the reason we think this may be acceptable and true is that, again, the AOP pathway, right, where all apical endpoints are derived from molecular change. And we think that this transcriptome POD will be protective of any adverse effect. So there are a couple of graphs showing here just the concordance between a molecular POD and an apical POD, and in all the studies that we have where this has been examined so far, there's typically a very good correlation between an omic POD and an apical POD. So although this method may not be able to identify a specific point, a specific apical endpoint, a specific hazard, we think it's going to be protective of all potential apical endpoints, and so could be used in a safety assessment to protect human health. So I think Scott is going to take over from here.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see me? Because I'm seeing Cam.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm just going to finish this off here. Shouldn't a couple minutes. So just some of our 2022 achievements. We got a roundtable session accepted for SOT 2023 in Nashville. Hope you all are going to be there and attend the session. And then there's been some work that has sort of bubbled up from the group, looking at some critical issues in relation to how we integrate this approach with some of our guideline level studies, specifically looking at variation that occurs as a byproduct of doing FFP-based gene expression versus fresh frozen, derived from slides that were taken in some cases from 28 days, some days from 14-day studies, and seeing how much variability there is from within each tissue, as there's greater degrees of heterogeneity across different tissues, so the variability could be greater based upon sampling. Next slide. So first, the roundtable. The roundtable is focused on this idea of establishing a concerted molecular change, how this relates to a point of departure, and whether or not it's possible to establish a health protective POD that can be used in risk assessment. We have representation across academic, government, and private sector groups. Really a wonderful group of individuals with a tremendous amount of expertise in the area of translating some of these newer approaches into risk assessment. And so I think it's going to be an outstanding roundtable and discussion. And hopefully you all can attend and potentially have some input. Next. So the group is working on a couple of different things. One of the next big steps for the group is developing a consensus analysis and bioinformatics pipeline. First, we are going to formulate a call to action paper, followed by a potential workshop to work out the nuances. And there are quite a few for those of you who have ventured down this path, and I think Cam has alluded to some of those. But I think in general, there is a pretty robust consensus on how to move forward in this space. So writing it down and getting agreement on it, I think will facilitate adoption even more. One of the things that we are trying to motivate people to do is to share their existing data, so we can basically look at the relationship between cancer points of departure and apical points and molecular points of departure. We're trying to get together a collaboration with the carcinogenomics group, who've actually gone through and done an extensive amount of curation of carcinogenicity data for their purposes and deriving signatures, mode of action signatures. Other key uncertainties I think the group is trying to deal with is to evaluate whether or not we need to evaluate a greater range of tissues. There are a number of groups that are a number of members of the group that work in different groups that have explored these different tissue samplings. I've heard up to 10 different tissues that have been evaluated in an individual study. So there's a question of, whether or not that's necessary, or whether we can use sentinel tissues such as liver and kidney. Another big question is whether or not we have to cover a greater diversity of life stages. And right now, what we typically do is take juvenile animals and we expose them for a short period of time through what equates to basically early puberty. The question is, do we need to evaluate development? Do we need to expose during development before we do the transcriptomic analysis? So things along those lines, and whether or not there's a need for expanding to additional species. When we, with the cancer bioassay, we do rats and mice typically. Would it be necessary to cover, they say, at least male rats and female mice, or would we need both sexes in both species? So there's, again, these questions sort of linger in, and I think they're going to be necessary to address in order to facilitate adoption of the approach for use and risk assessment. And then finally, our proposed approach to integration into existing tests. It's something we've thought through. No one wants to run redundant tox studies. If it's possible that we can adopt the use of formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissues, and we have paired histopathology, that would be ideal. I think we need to optimize some of the approaches for processing formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissue to get them to more closely agree with our purified RNA studies. And we also have to deal with issues related to extra noise that's introduced with the formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissues in the analysis pipeline. Next slide. And finally, I just want to say thank you. And I want to acknowledge the group. It's been, conquering something like changing the way we approach toxicology testing is no small task. And the group has been really great and accommodating and dealing with the many layers of issues that have manifest themselves in discussing this approach of using a molecular pointer departure for risk assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to take questions if people have them. We have some time. One thing that I've seen come up across the different committees is, this need for maybe samples that already exist. I know, there's been individual efforts in some of our groups and some of the GTTC works, but maybe a connection between those of some kind of inventory of existing samples would be beneficial to this work and other teams. So I don't know, Scott, if is that something that's been explored, maybe some kind of inventory of what's at like NIEHS or at the different companies?
So we have, for the carcinogenomics group, I think we have a lot of samples available for subsequent mining, particularly through the drug matrix acquisition. From a dose response standpoint, they're a little bit harder to come by. Now, we do have slides in certain cases that are potentially available, and I think EPA has a pretty good collection of those also. Question is, there are methods for FFPE based processing, but there is a high degree of variability in the contract labs in how they are handled, and so you can get very variable data depending upon what you're dealing with. But there is that availability. And there also is, just from a analysis pipeline generation process, there's a tremendous amount of publicly available data that we've put out there along with EPA and other groups and Carol and the Health Canada group that we can work with to optimize our analysis pipeline. So just data existing, not samples, but a good bit of data. And Jason O'Brien has been pushing his way through organizing all that data to make it available to the group.
Thanks, Scott. Another question it's come up a few times in the maybe team meetings, but might be nice to address here is, we talked about we don't want this for hazard ID, but is there any way to maybe pick between activity versus adversity with this? Are there thoughts on that? I know you work with botanicals sometimes, pharmaceuticals that comes up as well.
Yeah, it's a challenging issue. I joke with people, it's going to be, if we really go down that path, and I think Cam is of the same mind, it will be gainful employment for our molecular biologists cross-trained as toxicologists for a very long period of time. Because you're in a situation where if you establish the standard that you need to link to adversity to make a decision, with systemic toxicity, depending on which toxicological pathologist you talk to, there's 6,000 endpoints. And we don't have good representation oftentimes of chemicals that cause those things. Now, there's another way of looking at it where you're taking a step into that direction of looking at adversity. And we are at NTP, well, at DTT now, are trying to step in that direction. We're trying to curate genes that tend to be indicative of toxicity. It's not specifically linking them to a specific pathology, but are sort of more of pan indicators. So the best example, and I'm sure this group is very familiar with, is KIM1, gene expression wise. So we are creating these subsets of genes that we're pretty confident in reflect adversity, and that'll be our first step in that direction. But it's a challenging area to deal with, depending on the degree of specificity you want and certainty, if you would, with respect to linkage to adversity.
Thanks
Cam, I
for
don't know
that.
if you climb in. I mean, we want to jump in on that or not.
Yeah, thanks for unmuting me. So I think that's a challenging question. It gets to the idea of, perhaps you need to understand mechanism, which is a long-term endeavor. We're trying to sort of remove ourselves from needing to identify mechanism to make it the technique useful in the shorter term.
Mhm.
I guess the other thing I would say is, if the method is able to identify either adaptive or adverse effects, and it is, quote, protective of either of those, then maybe I think that is sufficient from a human health protection standpoint.
Thanks, Cam. Question came in, I think kind of similar, or builds on what was just said from Frank Sister. He asked, could you describe the envisioned context of use and ask specific sectors like agrochem, chemical hazard labeling, cosmetics, pharmaceutical development, or any or all of these?
Go ahead, Scott.
So in my view of it, and I think Cam's is similar, anything where your intent is to manipulate a biological system with a given dose of a chemical where there is going to be inherent risk and you need to know severity, reversibility, monitorability. So everything in the pharmaceutical space, everything, at least the active ingredients, pharmaceuticals. Our current approach to this is not going to be applicable. It's going to be it's going to have challenges. Where the alternative, where we do think there's potential is where the intent really is the equivalent of a no biological effect level. And that's the goal. And so those spaces include agrochemicals, industrial chemicals, things along those lines. Cam, you probably put more nuance to that.
I don't think so. I guess, yeah. It really comes down to the intent of the product. Is the intent of the product to actually change the biological system, pharmaceuticals? And if that's the case, then I think you need to know what potential hazards may result from that. If the intent is to identify a safe use, as in the case of agrochemicals, I don't think you actually need to know the actual apical effect. You just need to identify a dose, the highest dose, where you don't see anything. It gets to the question of, again, what is the value of identifying a hazard in the chemical space? Is there value in that to protect human health? I think that's a major open question. Of course, some agencies require you to do that. They think there is value. It's certainly been the process traditionally, but does it actually protect human health?
Mm-hmm. And then Chris Corden asked, for this, overall the approach is promising. Has the group spent any time to identify outliers and why there is a disconnect between the transcriptomic point of departure and the traditional endpoints? So maybe back to that correlation graph that Scott, or I'm sorry, Cam presented earlier.
Yeah, I think some of it's going to come down to, and we've had a little bit of experience with this, is how selectively targeted a chemical is, and by which molecular initiating event it affects the system. There are certain molecular initiating events, nuclear receptors being the best known, that have a profound effect on the transcriptome, and oftentimes the transcriptional responses are a little bit more sensitive than the apical, than the eventual apical responses. On the flip side, there are things that affect, say, ion channels or things along those lines that tend to elicit, or even G protein coupled receptors that tend to elicit, at least in the early stages, a much more weaker transcriptional response, that make it a bit more challenging. And we've noticed, the famous one is thujone in our hands, at least, is that we have animals having seizures, and there are very limited changes in gene expression that are occurring. And so it's a select, I believe it's a GABAergic modifier, if I'm remembering correctly, but it's in absinthe. And so there are these lingering questions about certain modes of action that we may need to address. The one good thing, if you are doing this in vivo, most toxicologists probably tell you this, there's the opportunity for serendipitous discovery. Even if you may miss it with one metric, you will find it with others. So there is that component that I think is valuable.
Good. Thank you both. Their clarification came in from Allison at Frank's comment, and she wrote that it's probably more useful for the chemical space where you don't know the molecular target. I think that echoed what Kamin and Scott said too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's it. I mean, this is an open space after the papers come out. If folks are interested in this, I would encourage to get in touch with myself, Sedef, Kamin, and Scott, so we can keep moving forward. Thank you both for this presentation.